Today, my friend...
Skarbrand craves slaughter!
Yes, my friends, today we are unfortunately killing for corn. And as luck would have it, we're starting with my favorite blood to spill. Mother greenskins. And here he is, the biggest, the baddest, Skarbrand. But even a juiced up demon like this needs a crew. Bloodletters, Chaos Warriors and Warhounds, all led by Sakroska, the Blood Reaper. So boys, have at 'em. As this was my first Khorne campaign, I didn't know all that much, just that blood and skulls is like our bread and butter. Thankfully, the top knots had plenty of both, so to my amusement, the green skinning continued. Which was a very nice and bloody tutorial, letting me stock up on units, trade skulls for bonuses, and start leveling up our big red powerhouse. What? All of these buff weapon strength. Very fitting. And eventually the top knots had had enough of being butchered, so they sent legions of their best and brightest to stop us. Unsurprisingly, that ended in yet another bloodbath, sadly putting an end to our orc genocide. For now. So, heartbroken, I was left without enemies. However, our bloodshed had not gone unnoticed, as we were already striking fear in our neighbors' hearts. Malagor the Dark Omen came to us, pleading for a non-aggression pact. Which is a good time to mention that the closest we'll get to diplomacy in this campaign are war declarations. Anything else is banned.
Meet me in battle.
Therefore, in response to the cow, we slaughtered his beastmen in the sunken Kurnak, donating the blood to the Blood God, which for some reason spawned an army. Strange, but a disposable zero upkeep demon army was welcome nonetheless, because we were pretty far from being profitable. So with my blood host at my side, we hunted down Malagor himself, and as his giant came crashing down, so did his faction. And as it turns out, covering the ground in bovine blood pleased Khorne so much that we were being reinforced with a second Blood Reaper. A Kugu. You know what, buddy? You're gonna be a scout. Now that I was baptized in orc blood, with piles of animal skulls by my side, and at least somewhat familiar with demonic brute force, I was once again without enemies. So I decided to turn south, where I finally found a real challenge. Someone undying. Our next adversary was the great Cetra the Imperishable. I hate liars.
Insufficient slaughter here.
Cetra's lands and remaining legions were just as perishable as him, and my great duel with the so-called Tomb Kings was nothing more than an easy skull harvest. So up until now, we have crushed orcs, beastmen, and a so-called immortal king. Chapter 1, guys. And we haven't even broken a sweat. However, it didn't last long before my past caught up to me, because as I had been dealing with Cetra, a warlord to the north deemed my lands an easy conquest. Gore-bad Ironclaw.
Stick to the plan.
He had taken Grunty Mingol and was advancing on the rest of my very vulnerable settlements. So we rushed back up north, only to be immediately greeted by 4 armies outside of Ugrul Migdal, and our first predicted defeat. Although we had been outnumbered several times already, this was a whole other level. But we had stained these grounds with orc blood before, and by the blood god, we would do it again. The first army was nothing more than an appetizer, but as Skarbrand shattered their general, the main course had arrived. Thankfully, my Khorngors had vanguard deployment and were ready. We were not fighting alone either. Our blood host from the Malagor slaughter was still kicking and thirsty for blood. And yet despite this, the battle was starting to take its toll. Losses were piling up and the orcs were slipping through as my Khorngors were broken. But defeat is unacceptable, so we kept fighting them off, unit by unit, until eventually, through blood, and blood, the orcs were all either dead or shattered. Over 5,000 orcs, squigs, and war machines had come at us and failed. And this is where you really gotta admire the greenskin brain, because this massive defeat made them immediately attack us again, which ended even worse, bringing us a close victory. I thought you were the smart one, Gorbad. And fueled by these victories, Skarbrand and a couple of blood hosts kept pushing the Ironclaw orcs back, until we finally came across Gorbad himself. However, we were back at full strength by now, so even with Gorbad's war reinforcements, it was nothing more than straight butchery. But although we had reduced the Ironclaw orcs into a husk of what they once were, and were starting to become truly unchained, we were still bound by the shackles of economy. Khorne's income is basically only war and death, so without that, things would unravel fast. And at this point, I found myself deep within my own lands, once again without enemies. So to avoid going bankrupt, I turned east. Because if anyone truly deserves Khorne's wrath, it's Skaven. More specifically, Queek Headtaker.
Whiskers forward!
So we marched on Morgheim, the closest rat stronghold I could find, carrying out extremely bloody pest control and putting our numbers in the green. And thankfully for our economy, Queek and his rats had accrued a lot of settlements. So we got to work. Now, usually, killing Skaven feels like a chore, but in the hands of the Blood God, I actually enjoyed it. We slayed, maimed, and crushed Queek's forces in glorious battle, and in turn were rewarded. Because Skarbrand is a player of the great game, where so far Slaanesh and Nurgle had been on top, but now Khorne was ascendant, giving us access to more powerful unholy manifestations. So I evoked Slaughter Incarnate, giving Skarbrand a 300% boost on all experience gained, which came in handy because the rats were striking back. In the hills of Dringo Ruckers, we were once again faced with awful odds. 3 rat armies came at us, armed to the teeth with guns, blades, and firepower. However, I knew that if I could defeat all these armies, the rest of Clan Moors would be an easy grab. So they would get what they were asking for. Luckily, I had also made a few changes to my army. Most of my bloodletters were now exalted, and I had picked up both blood beasts and chariots, all of which were about to get a trial by warp fire. Once again, I set my Khorngors and blood beasts up to stop some of their reinforcements, and while they got set up, Skarbrand started the battle, launching the enemy into rampage as my bloodletters charged in. And it didn't take long before we had a nice big ball of rats, so I signaled my chariots. Skarbrand and his chariot hammers kept crushing rats as the beast squad held back waves of vermin. The rats had brought plenty of weapons teams, but they were all rendered pretty much useless as we kept things close. And soon enough, the decisive defeat was turned into a heroic victory. As predicted, dealing such a heavy blow to Clan Moors practically destroyed them. Queek managed to sneak away and try to get back at me by razing one of my settlements, only for it to be immediately drawn to destruction and returned to my hands. Dumb rat. And after a little more cleanup, Queek and Clan Moors were gone. This time, however, I did not find myself without enemies, because our right to blood was being challenged. Manfred von Karstein. We had left our desert settlements unchecked for too long, and he took that as an invitation.
Thine right is mine.
Thanks to the experience boost we had had earlier and about 20,000 dead rats, Skarbrand was now rank 50. So, confidently, we headed back down, to give Manfred the death he so desperately sought. However, we had barely made it to the sands before he attacked. He had caught us in force march with 3 additional armies. For a third time, we were heavily outnumbered and facing defeat. The difference was that this time, as we faced close to 10,000 undead, it was likely true. Thankfully, we had now been joined by a legendary villain. Sylar Unfingrim. And for once, I took a different approach, because although we were facing legions of fragile skeletons, 9,500 of them could bring us down nonetheless. So I put most of my army up against some sandy rocks, with Skarbrand, Sakroska and Sylar free to roam. And soon enough, thousands of undead were pouring onto the battlefield. And for the first time, it felt like too many. It wasn't. However, in chasing Manfred to the south, I had left my mountains undefended. My reign of blood was coming to an end, as both Belagar Ironhammer and Ungrim Ironfist had declared war, the definition of unstoppable force meets immovable object. But before I marched north once again to face the dwarves, I was in desperate need of an army upgrade. Chaos Warriors and Khorngors were no longer sufficient. So I spent a few turns killing off what remained of Manfred, and by his blood and skulls, built myself an army. We were almost ready to take on the dwarves. All that remained was picking up a pair of friends. So we did Skarbrand's quest battle, finally picking up his axes, increasing armor-piercing damage, melee attack, and giving us the Slaughter and Carnage ability, which increases weapon damage with every kill. Now, let's move some immovable objects. The first dwarven battle would take place at Valaya's Sorrow, a name I aimed to make appropriate. However, the dwarves had already formed quite a defense. Thousands of heavily armored dwarves all waiting to put us down. Once again we were heavily outnumbered, and once again we faced defeat. But like I said, I had built myself a new army. Minotaurs, gore beast chariots, exalted bloodletters, and the whole reason I wanted to play Khorne, Wrathmongers. I even went so far as to grab the Regiment of Renown, the Bloodwake Berserkers. And as if that wasn't enough, we had been reinforced with yet another legendary villain. Karanak. So boys, let's make some grudges. My army split up into 2 kill squads, brute force on one end and demonic flames on the other, to catch and slaughter as many dwarves as possible. Skarbrand ran right through their lines, eagerly waiting for the reinforcements, giving them a nice Khorne welcome. Meanwhile, my Wrathmongers led by Sakroska were already deep into the dwarven lines. Armor was broken, shields were splintered, and bodies torn apart. On the other flank, bloodletters were melting through slayers and ironbreakers all the same, littering the ground with dwarf bodies. But although their casualties were rising by the second, dwarves are as stubborn as they are short and were still standing strong, so I unleashed my chariots to start hammering their flanks. And in an act of desperation, they turned their flame cannons on Skarbrand, roasting their own units in the process. And finally, after smashing, maiming, killing, and dismembering, the dwarves broke and the unstoppable force prevailed. They did, however, manage to wound Karanak in the process, but our final bloody champion stood ready to take his place. Scar Bloodwrath, the undying champion. And it didn't take long before Karanak was back in action, so we moved on the mountains, butchering everyone we found. However, our recent carnage had sparked a resistance. Every dwarf we had killed had been tallied, and now the reckoning was coming. So fearing that this genuinely might be the end of my bloodshed, I did the only sensible thing and turned on humanity, marching into Empire lands for even more blood. War machines, knights, and brave men were no match for Khorne's fury, and after a few very bloody turns and relentless slaughter, the people of the Empire were no more. And so, soaked in blood and high on butchery, we faced our judgment.